The second session is actually it continues to the previous session's agendas. And the title is Building a Future Order of the Korean Peninsula, Strategic Communication, Extended Deterrence, and Cooperation for the new area, including nuclear nonproliferation. Those are the topics that we are going to discuss. And there are several key questions already offered to the panelists. That includes, first, it's about your views or United States, China, and South Korea's view of the future of the Korean Peninsula. This is very wide, the question. But our co-sponsor, Ministry of Unification, really wants to hear from you because they are very much interested in that topic. And the second, more directly to our today's discussion, is how can we build trust and confidence in deterrence, extended deterrence arrangements in Asia. We can draw on several historical examples too in discussing that. So it's an issue of strategic communication and transparency among concerned actors. And three, what I think this is the ultimate goal of today's conference. What are the areas of cooperation among three countries, United States, China, and South Korea, given the shared interest, for example, in the area of non-nuclear, non-proliferation, nuclear safety, nuclear security, things like that, and so which could be a stepping stone for further cooperation and for peaceful, prosperous, and symbiotic order of the region. So with that, let me very quickly introduce, because for the sake of time, I will be very brief. First, on my left, William Toby, who is an expert, leading expert on nuclear non-proliferation, terrorism, and arms control. He has a bright career, so you can read on this proceeding. Next, Oh Yang-wei, Mr. Oh Yang-wei, PhD in international security, who is a vice chairman of academic committee of the Grandview Institution. He is a premier expert on national security, defense strategy, and crisis management and border security in China. And third, presenter from EAI, who chairs EAI's National Security Program Center, and also Seoul National University professor. Professor Chun Jae-sung is a leading expert, literally leading expert in the field of international relations in Korea. And three excellent discussants. Professor Jia is present again. You're busy today, so I'll skip you. And next is Professor Francesca Giovannini. Welcome to Korea. She is an executive director of the project on managing ATOM at Harvard Kennedy School's Balfour Center. And she's a non-resident fellow of the Stanford University, and served as a very important position for many years. She, as you know, is the leading expert on arms control, regional nuclear proliferation dynamics, nuclear security, and insider threats. Finally, the last not the least, Professor Kim Tae-hyung from Sungsil University. He's a also very well-known experts on international security, nuclear proliferation and deterrence, and he also specialized in middle and small powers foreign policy. With that, our time management would be you present, three presenters spend about maximum 12 minutes. Sorry about that. If you go over that, you will not have time to respond later. So, and then 8 minutes each for the discussants, and we go this way. So, William, you go first.
Thank you very much. It's a delight to be back in Korea. One of my last trips before the onset of COVID was to Seoul with John Park, and it's just great to see many old friends. I should also say that the views I'm about to extend are my own and don't represent any other institution. I'd like to start, I'm going to talk mostly about the nonproliferation and the NPT. I'd like to start by offering some context of my own views. I'm both a nonproliferation treaty supporter and an optimist. I think despite some weaknesses, the treaty has performed well. Several decades ago, there were 9 states with nuclear weapons. Today, there are 9 states with nuclear weapons. We've traded South Africa for North Korea, arguably not a great trade, especially if you live here. But still, it's been a stable regime which has really been an asset to international peace and security. Despite all that, observers from Robert McNamara on have worried over the possibility of greater proliferation. And the death of the NPT has been predicted many times. All of those observers have been proven wrong. I'm worried that this time may be different. Why? There's a saying in the nuclear safety realm that an accident anywhere is an accident everywhere. I fear that the attacks on the Non-Proliferation Treaty in places away from the Korean Peninsula will have far-ranging effects to include on the Korean Peninsula. The world changed as much in February of 2022 as it did in November of 1989 and December of 1991 when the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union collapsed. We're in a very different world today than the last time I was in Korea. Russia is not only violating the international order, it is vandalizing it. I don't mean to trivialize this, but it's the difference between merely speeding and taking down all the speed limit signs. They're trying to destroy norms and law that have been built up over decades. This poses a direct threat to non-proliferation policy in several ways. By attacking the Budapest Memorandum, they attack the security of non-nuclear weapon states everywhere. By shielding Iran from responses to Tehran's violation not only of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, but also its safeguards agreement with the IAEA, they undermine the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And I would just ask, does anyone believe that Iran worries that it might have to come before the UN Security Council when Russia, wielding a veto, is receiving drones from Iran? By threatening nuclear use, Russia directly attacks the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And most importantly, by attacking the very idea of international law. That cannot help but have consequences for the Korean Peninsula. Russia was a party to the six-party talks. And I would add that those countries who fail to oppose, or worse, tacitly support the lawlessness that Russia is exhibiting are complicit in undermining the Non-Proliferation Treaty. I was going to point out that sadly, since the 2000s, when there was active diplomacy attempting to reverse the North Korean nuclear weapons program, and I attended the six-party talks hosted by China, that diplomacy is essentially stalled. That alone is of concern. I was even more concerned to hear Professor Jia raise the possibility that China might reverse its support for nonproliferation. So what is to be done about all this? We face a situation where 2 of the nuclear weapon states under the Nonproliferation Treaty and 2 of the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council may be either rethinking or directly attacking nonproliferation policy. I don't believe that the correct response is further proliferation. I think instead that like-minded nations must act together. Those that believe in democracy, human rights, and rule of law must stand together and support those values as well as nonproliferation. Those shared values are our greatest source of strength. In pursuit of those shared values, we must prepare an active defense. We must defend not only the norms, values, and laws, but we must also be prepared with more tangible defense. I believe that extended deterrence has been the most successful nonproliferation policy in history, and that the best evidence of that is the fact, I think, that the difference between Poland, which is a member of NATO and therefore a beneficiary of U.S. extended deterrence, and Ukraine has not been lost on other observers. Fortunately, South Korea is a treaty ally of the United States and a beneficiary of extended deterrence. Both the United States and Korea will need to act more closely, but also with others in the region and others globally, to stand up to the threats to nonproliferation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Next is Dr. Oh Young-wei.
Thank you, President. Thank you for having me to have time to share my personal point of view on this topic. According to the meeting, according to the topic, I want to share some of our view on striving for the cooperation in a strategic dilemma. I think we fear the difficult times, all of you, including several relevant countries around the Korean Peninsula. I think no matter the global scope or the Asian-Pacific region, especially on the Korean Peninsula, security issues are very prominent and risk level is rising, is indeed. But bearing in mind the human destiny, I always think the human have their own wisdom and common interests for the sake of peace and stability in the Asian-Pacific region and the future of the world. Relevant countries should focus on the overcoming obstacles and seek cooperation. In the face of strategic dilemma, we do have a strategic dilemma. Which is wrong, which is right, and difficulties. I think the basis and the principles for the cooperation between the relevant countries on the Korean Peninsula still exist. In recent years, relevant countries in the Korean Peninsula have undergone some changes, many changes, in their own strategies and military capabilities. These changes are influenced by major power competition. As the panelists said earlier on, regional security conflicts and are also related to their own strategic needs. Every country have their own interests. The development of China-US relation is at a low point, with defense security dialogue, exchanges, and cooperation are basically in a standstill, stopped. No any kind of a conversation and dialogue officially. The United States has intensified pressure on China in political, economic, and security fields. China feels more and more pressure from the United States. And the confrontation between the two countries in many aspects is on the rise, which is a negative impact, as I said earlier on in several meetings, on the cooperation of the nuclear issue and peace and stability on the peninsula. The DPRK continues to develop nuclear weapons, adjusts its nuclear policy, as some experts speak earlier on, and upgrade its nuclear capability, which is regarded as a basic strategic means. I think they are not just focused on the conventional warfare, but nuclear weapons is basic strategic means for their own national security and regime stability. At the same time, frequent missile launches have increased instability in the peninsula and making peace on the peninsula in the becoming more unpredictable. The ROK's policy currently toward DPRK is getting tougher. The ROK-US alliance has upgraded and extended its deterrence, has become concrete, including moving nuclear weapons in the use for deterrence, and even attempt to use the nuclear weapons for retaliate. The adjustment of the security relations between the ROK and Japan has made coordination and joint command of military forces of ROK, Japan, and the United States are easier. But clearly, it's not a really aligned triangle alliance, but coordinated, much more easier, I think. Therefore, it is mainly focused on the peninsula and regional security issues. But it's obviously increasing the strategic pressure on DPRK. I don't think they have not clearly response currently, but they really think they're facing the strategic pressure more than ever, and tension on the Korean Peninsula. The Russia-Ukraine war has made Russia-US relations in a quasi-hostile state, something like the enemy. The relationship between ROK and Russia declined. I think the government of South Korea will send some ammunition, maybe to the Ukraine, and relationship between Russia and the DPRK is strengthened. So a lot of changes which made Russia's policy for issue of denuclearization on the peninsula with uncertainty. I don't know. Despite this, in general, the basic position of relative countries on the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula has not changed. Entirely, I think is a common interest. An overall strategic balance on the Korean Peninsula. What I mean is the overall strategic balance on the Korean Peninsula, also fragile, but still exists. Therefore, the possibility of sudden change, the crisis suddenly changed the peninsula within a certain period of time, is relatively small. Someone maybe think will be happen next time, is very quickly. I don't think so. And the basis on architecture for the relevant parties to seeking cooperation still exists. We should look the other side. Second, the regional order on the Korean Peninsula is less likely to turn to a Cold War. Many people like to talking about the new Cold War. The initiative from U.S. trilateral ministerial dialogue mechanism was established in 2010 with aim of coordination policy towards the DPRK. This tripartite system is characterized by the U.S.-led security partnership, but it's still not state of alliance. There would be a part of components within trilateral security cooperation, especially focused to China. Many people of China worry about that. But the main focus is more likely on the possible crisis on the Korean Peninsula. The recent improvement of our Japan relations, many people very interesting about this. It's mainly due to the mutual political, economic, and security interests of the two countries. Yes, we can focus on security matters, but at the same time, we have to look at the political and the economic issues. And reason have been told is increased security pressure on ROK and Japan coming from a tense situation in the Korean Peninsula. At the same time, adjustment of our Japan relations, we also help the United States coordinate the security policies of the two allies. On the other hand, from the perspective of maintaining the overall order of the Northeast Asia, the normalization of relation between ROK and Japan, especially end of the trade war, also have certain conducive and useful for stability and prosperity of the Northeast Asia. My personal point of view, the relevant countries in Northeast Asia should be normalized. It may possibly have a certain promoting effort on the construction of the free trade zone in Northeast Asia. The maintenance of healthy and balanced economic and trade relations among China, Japan, and ROK is conducive to the prosperity and stability of Northeast Asia. In general, although relevant countries have undergone some strategic changes due to internal and external factors and have conflicting interests, but they still share same overall interests in nuclear safety, security, and stability in the peninsula. Therefore, in the future, it is unlikely that relevant countries will abandon denuclearization policy and regional stability. Who want to abandon about this? And to pursue bloc confrontation, leading to a Cold War. Third, in the complex international environment, countries and still seek space for cooperation on the Korean Peninsula. Competition between the major powers and disputes around relevant countries in today's world does not mean confrontation in no fields. As long as there is no sharp confrontation in terms of core interests, I think Mr. Jia just mentioned earlier on, cooperation in other areas is possible. On the Korean Peninsula, China and the United States and the ROK should have the same general understanding on safeguarding nuclear safety, security, avoid nuclear war on the peninsula, and preventing conflict and war. As for China, it's a shared long border with North Korea. South Korea is the same. If there is a military conflict or nuclear security issue on the peninsula that leads to a nuclear war, and interests of the all parties will suffer heavy losses, and regional international security framework will be overturned. I'm not sure if it's overturned yet or not. Even in a state of strategic competition between China and US, it is still possible for China and the United States, or China and the ROK, to cooperate in some areas related to the peninsula, such as nuclear safety and related environmental issues, such as humanitarian assistance, including food shortages, disasters, and refugees, bilateral and multilateral dialogue on the issue of nuclear safety on the peninsula, including nuclear accident, nuclear leak caused by nuclear pollution, geological disaster caused by nuclear test, etc. Nuclear security and regional stability. We can talk about this. All parties should make practical efforts to reduce tensions on the peninsula. It should be noticed that although bilateral dialogue between the US and our DPRK is important, but it cannot truly resolve the nuclear and security issues entirely on the peninsula, because the peninsula issue involves interests of all parties. 3, and lastly, although the six-party talks which aim at resolving nuclear safety, security, and stability on the peninsula have been suspended. Someone said it stopped. Someone said it's failure. But the basic rules and the principles are not updated. If there is no effective framework for multilateral talks and dialogues for time being, in my perspective, any possible bilateral, maybe 2, maybe 3, maybe 4, maybe 5, and multilateral dialogue with the aim of promoting denuclearization, security and stability on the peninsula will be useful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And next is Professor Chun.
Thank you very much. Well, I have a paper, and the basic question is, can we find the space for US-China cooperation, which will give South Korea a better strategic space to find out our own national interests? That's the basic question. And it's great to have trilateral conference here after several years so that we can find each two great powers' perception of each other, and then how we can contribute, South Korea can contribute to promote cooperation in this relationship. So the paper is composed of 4 parts. I will go through major arguments one by one. The first one is about the general evaluation of US-China relations, which is very well known, but let me go to the very basic points. I think the US-China relations may be adversarial, but still it's based on strategic distrust that we can ultimately solve. It's a logic of security dilemma. There might be some misperception of each other. From US perspective, China is expected to surpass the US as the world's biggest economy very soon. There is still an argument about China's peaking, but we'll see. And China has been increasing its military expenditure and weapons technology. So US doubts that China's increasing economic power may enable China's military overtake. The main problem is US consider China as a revisionist state to expand its military power over several areas, the hotspots in East Asia, eventually blocking the sea lane of communication in East Asia. And China is expanding its military influence by establishing military bases in countries belonging to BRI and other Pacific countries as well. On the other hand, China perceives that US is containing China to frustrate its development unjustly and to prevent it from expanding its influence. So China's sovereignty claims to the island over the South China Sea, East China Sea, Taiwan and Hong Kong are legitimate to Chinese population, and the US intervention to these issues are unjust actions to prevent China's development. And we have Russia's invasion, as two previous presenters already talked about. And there is a Ukraine-China-Taiwan analogy which aggravates the the current situation. But after the Bali summit meeting last year, November, I find some positive changes. So I wrote down the former Prime Minister China, Wang Yi. He notes that even though there are some confrontations between two countries, but he has some very cautious optimism. So he stated that China and the United States cannot decouple or sever supply chains. Under new circumstances, the common interests between two countries have increased, not decreased. So China has advanced the principle to reject, block confrontation and zero-sum competition and maintain strategic stability in relation with other major countries. On the other hand, from U.S. side, very interestingly, Jake Sullivan, the security advisor, recently suggests that many things, the past 30 years world order has many problems, and U.S. is trying to reorder the orders in many areas, including security and economy. So he tried to present a vision for the ultimate goal of U.S.-China strategy. So far, inside the U.S. and also in South Korea, many have criticized the lack of clarity in the purpose of U.S.-China strategy thus far. So what is the ultimate goal of U.S.-China strategy? So from U.S. side, it's necessary to present a more explicit strategic framework in the long run. The U.S. does not want confrontation or conflict with China, but aims to compete responsibly and manage this competition in a responsible manner, which is very interesting. So as Professor Jia said in the first session, the concept of competition, I think that's the core question, how we can interpret competition. From Eastern culture, like in South Korea or in China, competition may sound somewhat uncomfortable, but South Korea is also a neoliberal country. We think that competition is very important and productive. So going back to Sullivan again, so in order to achieve a mature relations, it is important to engage in continuous dialogue and restore diplomacy, which is good. So I term that as rules-based competition. So competition is fine, but it should be within some rules and norms. And that rules and norms should be made not just by two countries, but also with the advice of other countries, third-party countries like South Korea or other middle power countries, European Unions, and so on. So according to Sullivan, these policies are not aimed at decoupling, but at de-risking and diversifying, as Professor John Bach mentioned. So these points are echoed by Janet Yellen, the U.S. Treasury Secretary. So she explains many things. The basic argument is that bilateral economic independence is very important in all sectors, except for cutting-edge technologies that have national security and military implications. And complete decoupling from China is impossible and not beneficial. However, as China has persistently engaged in unfair economic practices that violate basic norms under the liberal trade regime, tensions between U.S. and China are inevitable until this is resolved. So there is some differences in perspectives, I guess, between two countries. Then where is South Korea? President Yoon Suk-yeol's adoption of the Indo-Pacific concept as a central geopolitical focus. By the way, China has argued that the concept of Indo-Pacific is basically to contain China. So we have very different views about the geopolitical regional concept of Indo-Pacific. But our government has issued, as you know, the Indo-Pacific report. And that creates the impression that South Korea will take Chinese policy in this region seriously, a little bit in a negative sense. As manifested in the state visit, President Yoon's emphasis on values, especially the value of freedom closely related to human rights, will likely encourage the United States to expect South Korea's stronger stance toward China. The fundamental issue is whether both Yoon and Biden will be on the same page regarding the nature of the threat coming from China, and the ultimate goal of two countries, China policy. But South Korea has maintained a less alarmist view of China's rise. There are indeed elements contributing to decreasing optimism toward China, increasingly colliding economic interests between South Korea and China, and also a very low level of favorability toward China these days among South Koreans. And China's passive and permissive stance toward North Korea's nuclear provocations. However, it is also true that China does not pose direct military and security threats to South Korea, because two countries lack territorial disputes, for example, and China's diplomatic support for dealing with North Korea is still very important. So under these circumstances, the arms races between US and China is increasing. Strategic competition is still there. So we try to find out some strategic space, South Korea, to enhance cooperation between two countries. But the real problem is how will these overall relations will influence security relations between US and China. The second point, so security conflicts between US and China can be divided into three areas: gray zone conflicts, competition over conventional warfare, and growing competition in the nuclear weapons sector. This project is focused on nuclear issue because nuclear imbalance between two countries are in the background for all these gray zone conflict and conventional warfare. So far, we have maintained a great imbalance between US and China in nuclear weapons in favor of the United States. But as we know, we see a rapidly growing China's capability in nuclear weapons and delivery systems. So how that will impact on the general US-China relations, maybe in the 2030s, after that will be very important. And so far, US has maintained several nuclear strategies toward China. We have to ask American specialists here. But if China's nuclear capabilities continue to grow and force the US to recognize mutual vulnerability, it's an asymmetrical vulnerability, but probably we will reach at the point of MAD, mutual assured destruction at some point. Then US may change their nuclear policy toward China from damage minimization strategy, which is arguable, but focus on more mutual deterrence. Then how will this MAD situation will affect the conventional situation between two countries? For example, stability-instability paradox, where we have more risks in conventional warfare if China is confident about its nuclear capability to cope with US military coercion or policy, then maybe we have a more violent conventional warfare situations. So we have to deal with that until we reach that point. So we have to make deal with overall US-China relations so that we don't have that adversarial nuclear situations in the coming decade. The third part is about North Korean nuclear issues, which we have dealt with in the first session, so I'll be very quick. For South Korea's point of view, to have a reassurance from US part has been very important. From last year, we had a lot of conferences, bilateral one between South Korea and the US. But on the basis of Washington Declaration, I think most of the part dealt with assurance, even though we dealt with deterrence part. So we have a higher level of reassurance between South Korea and the United States. But what about the deterrence part? As Professor Byrne talked about, we are provoking North Korea in some sense. So we have to maintain some communication. The basic elements of deterrence is to maintain the communication with the adversarial counterpart. So we have to show some signals to North Korea that we are defensive and try to enhance deterrence, not aggressive posture. And also we have to talk with the Chinese, what are the basic intention of our enhancing deterrence. But there is still a growing skepticism about the complete denuclearization of North Korea. And North Korea has a very strong intention to increase their nuclear powers and delivery systems. So this is a time not just for extended deterrence, but also for extended negotiation or extended diplomacy with North Korea. So we have to take all things into consideration, which is very hard because we have focused so much about deterrence and reassurance. Can we change the direction toward more effective diplomacy and engagement with North Korea? So this is time to prepare a roadmap for negotiations with North Korea. I'm almost, time is up. So the last part is, can we find out some leeway for US-China cooperation? South Korea's basic position is that the significance of existing multilateral rules-based order is very important. So we have to urge both US and China to collaborate and enhance. We have many issues, as Professor Ho Yang already talked about, terrorism, health crisis, all those things, unregulated new technologies. But a little bit abstract, but important thing is that compromise and cooperation does not exclude competition. So South Korea can benefit from a healthy competition between US and China. So rules-based competition and competition-based new rules will contributing to a new order in East Asia. So we try to find out, and South Korea try to find some chance to help these two countries. And in that sense, North Korea issue or issues on the Korean Peninsula will have a chance to contribute to the cooperation between two countries. So how can South Korea contribute to these issues will be very pivotal in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Three speakers have touched upon assessment of the future, particularly U.S.-China rivalry, and also it raised the issue of arms race, nuclear arms race, and potential implications for South Korea, Korean Peninsula, and also touched upon the issue of extended deterrence, and you just used it as extended deterrence, as nonproliferation. So and a few other issues, nuclear safety related environmental agendas, and we also, we also discussed, deterrence, reassurance, and negotiation. Unfortunately, we have 15 minutes, maybe maximum 20 minutes. So there are arguments and also, raised questions. So you, I don't know how you respond, but it seems like we have, each of you have about 7 minutes, less than 7 minutes to discuss. Very sorry about that. Yes, Professor Jia, you start first.
I'll be very, very brief. I agree with Professor Toby's point that is the non-proliferation treaty has been worked quite well until recently. It's under threat. It's a great concern, actually. It's a very good regime. It has worked to keep the world safe from a nuclear disaster. But the problem is, we are facing a lot of challenges. one of the challenges is the U.S. itself. It's selling nuclear submarines to Australia. How do you explain this? And also, it's actively, publicly talking about deploying technical nuclear weapons in South Korea and also maybe in Japan. And that's U.S. is the greatest supporter of the non-proliferation regime, but then the recent developments, how do you explain this kind of thing? The second question is to Ouyang Wei. I agree that nuclear safety is a shared interest in the region. And you mentioned that pragmatic steps have to be taken to ensure that. Maybe you want to elaborate, what kind of pragmatic steps we can take now to address the current nuclear problem. And for Professor Chong, both China and the U.S. want stability. That's true. Actually, both have voiced a strong commitment to that. But the problem is the reality is much more complicated. I agree with you that we should. Well, actually, I personally think competition is not a bad thing. But the problem is maybe I'm too. I received too much Western education. I argue that we should have benign competition instead of malign competition. Benign competition is to compete to do better, okay, ourselves. To malign competition is to make sure that the other side cannot do things, so undermine others' efforts. So I think China and the U.S. should engage in benign competition if we have to. Okay, but the problem is how to get there. So my question to Professor Chong is, in recent visit to Washington, the South Korean president talked about, the Taiwan issue. That caused a strong reaction from China. So could you explain the South Koreans' position on that, and why? What's the background for that thing? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and good morning. It's the first time I'm taking the floor, so I really want to thank the East Asia Institute for inviting me. It's always wonderful to be back in Korea. I come quite often. So I think when one talks about the future world order or the future order in East Asia, I think two questions need to be raised. One is this East Asia order is going to be designed how and composed by whom? Because there is a very fundamental difference between a regional order that is emerging out of a catastrophic competition and war, and another one that instead, made out of accommodation and diplomacy. And I think these two paths are not inevitable, right? So at this point, we are at the brink of one or the other. And so this is what's at stake today. Now, it is true, though, the East Asia order, in my view, will be shaped predominantly by the US-China cooperation and competition. And as a result of the East Asia order, we will also shape the global order. So very different from the Cold War, I think it's going to be a regional order here emerging that will ultimately have deep repercussions at the global level. I think when we talk about US and China relation, I think the papers highlight two dynamics, but I want to emphasize them, especially for students here of international relations. I think there is no doubt that there is a security dilemma at place. So the two countries are locked in, and so they cannot increase their security without decreasing their security. But there is a second dynamic here, which is what Bob Cohen and Joe Nye called complex interdependence, right? And this is what John Park talked about. We can't understand China-US cooperation and competition only from a security dilemma standpoint. It is also true that their growth, their wealth, their status in the world fundamentally depend on how well this cooperation between the two countries is going to go. And so these two dilemmas, this push and pulls, make this relation so interesting and so ambivalent, right? Deep, acute competition and deep needed cooperation. Now, DPRK, and I think it's really interesting because here we are in a deep crisis, DPRK can offer a fantastic opportunity. It is, in my view, a great power cooperation test, right? We can succeed and show that accommodation and diplomacy can work, or we can fail. So I think DPRK as a crisis offer, in fact, President Biden and President Xi and the future US president a great opportunity. Let me mention how this is the case. Now, both papers explore how DPRK put pressure on extended deterrence. But I actually argue that DPRK puts a lot of pressure on China too. The Chinese have no interest in seeing the South Koreans go nuclear, or Japan go nuclear, or Australia going nuclear. So the problem, the crisis of North Korea cannot only be depicted as a US problem, right? It is a China problem too. And North Korea puts pressure on two very important pillars of the nuclear order. One is extended deterrence, no doubt about it. The US has been called out, it has to be more credible, provide more assurances, develop, better capabilities, catch up with North Korea. But hey, it puts a lot of pressure on the nuclear non-proliferation regime too. And China has been a major player and a responsible power in that. So both countries have vital stakes here. It's not that we have asymmetric stakes in handling North Korea, it is a symmetry of stakes. And I think it's really important that China recognizes this and gets to the table, as it did, by the way, with the six-party talks, right? So let's change this narrative that all of a sudden is a US problem. These are great powers that sit in the same region that have a serious nuclear issue at hand. Now, let me also mention that what I found interesting in the two papers is, though, how I think the Chinese perspective on the North Korean crisis and the South Korean perspective differ. I think both did a fantastic job in exploring how acute this crisis is. But here we have a problem of sequencing, right? I think the Chinese perspective is to say, look, we have a deep security problem in North Korea. We need to go through the political and economic cooperation angle, right? This is the first step in order to reduce insecurity. I think the US and South Korea comes from a different sequencing. First security, then political and economic cooperation. And by the way, these sequencing dilemmas are not new. They've always existed. We have been locked into a sequencing problem with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. So these things, we know how to handle them. But that requires a very, very long-term commitment to dialogue, to resolve first this sequencing strategy problem, right? We see probably the crisis the same way, but we go at solving it in very different. Now, let me just raise three questions to our phenomenal speakers. The first one is, I think China and the United States need to clarify with each other the meaning of crisis. I've been in dialogues with many Chinese scholars, and I think we actually don't understand what crisis means for both countries. How does it look like? Do you need loss of life? Do you need major entanglements? Because I think we can't talk seriously about crisis management or crisis prevention if we don't know when a crisis starts. So I think that would be very important. Second point, how do we insulate cooperation from deep entrenched domestic factors? I think especially in South Korea and in the United States, the polarization of China has grown increasingly acute. So even if people want to collaborate or cooperate with China, the cost of cooperation are enormous domestically. So how do we insulate this? And finally, what is the right level of institution to bring that dialogue to bear? I will say in the following session that I think multilateralism really provides a fantastic channel, But I would like to hear whether you guys think, is it mere informal cooperation? Is it through academia, mill-mill cooperation? Where should this dialogue take place? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Taehyung Kim. I'm greatly honored to be here. It's to such a prestigious conference. I've been asked to comment on Professor Toby and Oang Wei, so I'm gonna make my comment short. Professor Toby discussed about a path forward on nuclear non-proliferation, and the recent situation is not very good because of the egregious violation of Russia by invading Ukraine. It's been a direct threat to norms and rules of international society, and also direct threat to the NPT. And also, nuclear saber rattling by Putin from time to time has been bad for the NPT and also bad for the Korean Peninsula. Under this challenging situation, what should be done? Professor Toby said that further proliferation is not an answer, and extended deterrence has been the most successful NPT policy in history. I absolutely agree with him, but I must say that I'm not as optimistic as Professor Toby regarding the future of the NPT. It looks like, in terms of nuclear weapons, United States already confronts enormous challenges. Nuclear force modernization, providing reassurance through extended deterrence to allies, and efficient nuclear arms control, and the preservation of the NPT, etc. But if you look at the current international politics, what is the most determining moment is the great power competition is rising again. So the United States and Russia and China are also, all of them are currently modernizing their nuclear forces. The United States has been modernizing its forces, nuclear forces, for quite some time. All nuclear triad has been being invested to modernize and upgrade and for the next couple of decades. And Russia has been upgrading and building new weapon systems in nuclear forces, like Kinzhal or Poseidon and things like that. And China, in terms of China, according to Pentagon reports, China is substantially building and increasing its nuclear arsenal. So according to the estimate, by 2030, China would have 1,000 nuclear weapons, and by 2035, 1,500 nuclear weapons. If this kind of ominous forecast materializes, then countries, the great powers would have enormous pressure, especially the United States, would have been given enormous pressure, especially in terms of preserving non-proliferation treaty and also how to provide extended deterrence to its allies. So I think it's quite urgent and imperative for concerned parties to proceed nuclear arms control talks, which has been quite almost useless for quite some time, because the only surviving significant nuclear arms control treaty is New START, and its future is still very uncertain. And since I think the nuclear arms control among the great powers and NPT need to go together to be more efficient, the talks need to start sooner than later. And another concern that I have is that recent significant level of technological advancement in more precision, better sensoring, sensor systems, and cyber and satellite has provided better counterforce capability to nuclear powers. So if that's the case, then other nuclear powers would have less confidence about the survivability of their nuclear weapons. Then the chain reaction could happen. They would need to build more and better nuclear weapons, and that means more fierce arms race and lowering of strategic stability. So I think this situation is happening to many, if not all, of the nuclear powers around the world at this moment. So then this also could give very negative impact on the arms control as well as non-proliferation treaty. So I'd like to ask Professor Toby what you think of this, my prediction. And speaking of extended deterrence, the last week South Korea and the United States agreed in the summit meeting, agreed on and declared Washington Declaration, and agreed to substantial increase in consultation and cooperation between the allies on nuclear matters. I think it's the right direction to go as an alliance to more effectively deal with North Korean threat. And also it could help to alleviate some of the concerns by some South Koreans who want to build our own nuclear capability. But when I saw that, I was kind of worried that there has been a bit too much emphasis on nuclear weapons. Because this level of the salience of nuclear weapons is that it could give some wrong impression that the maintenance of the alliance between the United States and South Korea and the deterrence against the North Korean nuclear threat is could only done by nuclear weapons. That is not good, especially if you think about this kind of overemphasis of the role and function of the nuclear weapons, because it could give negative impact on the alliance itself down the road, and also to nuclear arms control, the NPT. So I'd like to ask the Professor Toby about this situation as well. And regarding Professor Ouyang Wei's presentation, I agree with you. Even though the current situation is quite bad among the countries in East Asia, there are common grounds. There are common interests we share, and okay. But just one thing. Even though there are fundamental differences, there is a common ground we all agree with. But how to proceed and what to prioritize would be very difficult, because after all of us, all of the countries in the region are blaming each other. Because of you, we are in this mess. So what are you going to do? We want this, and the other countries say some another thing to even start the dialogue. So what would be your answer to start, and how to include the most disobedient actor like North Korea to this dialogue, and how to make agenda setting to start the dialogue. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Those are excellent comments. We are over time, but I think we will have to extend because you will have to respond to the great questions. So let me give 3 minutes each. So I think I will extend 10 minutes. So why don't you start first?
Thank you. I should clarify that I'm neither a professor nor a doctor. I was once a lecturer, but that sounds bad even to me. So I'll just answer 3 of the points. Many good ones have been made, but I thought I should get back on 3 of them. Australia has agreed to legal and physical steps that would ensure that the fuel in the submarines could never be used for weapons purposes. And it also has an unblemished record of non-proliferation treaty compliance and support. Second, I know of no U.S. executive official who has suggested deployment of nuclear weapons in Japan or the ROK. That said, we do have a free press and open debate, including even views that are not official government policy. Third, I agree that the reemergence of great power competition is the great challenge of our time. The issue is larger than nonproliferation, and that's why I am so firm in asserting that the United States, the European Union, South Korea, Japan, and Australia need to band together, not only for nonproliferation purposes, but for other security reasons. And I'm also quite confident that we can be effective. Those countries together have a GDP that exceeds $48 trillion. That's an enormous amount of resources that can be brought to bear to provide for international peace and security.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the three discussions. The very good questions, but very difficult to answer. I think these issues, from my point of view, we should divide the different issues. Nuclear safety, for example, and nuclear security, the different concept. I think nuclear safety is among us very serious problems. Nuclear safety also belongs to the NTS, I mean the non-traditional security issues. Can we start on this? I think nobody opposes it. I think if we sit here and talking about nuclear safety, I think even North Korean will agree that. Because it's the people's life, you know, we share a border with the North, and the North and share a border with the South. I think if a nuclear leak and nuclear test around the environmental problems, I think the new human being problems. So we like to start as some dialogue with the United States, with the South Korean, maybe the other parties, I think. Look at the, Fukushima Daiichi nuclear leak. I think everybody noted that is disastrous. So if something happened in the North, how do we deal with? Secondly, we can share some kind of information scientifically. It's not very sensitive. It's beyond the big power competition. So as a military-military relations, I like to maybe, because we are neighbor, something like the China and South Korea, we do have a mechanism to dialogue. I mean the hotline. Even we have the hotline with the United States. We have a hotline with the South Korean in the regional and military region, and a third army, I think. It's very positive. Can we restart our dialogues bilaterally? Maybe in the second track, maybe in the 1.5 track. Thank you.
Thank you for Professor Jia's question about South Korea's Taiwan policy. If you read the summit statement from 21, 22, 23, we have mentioned the issues related to Taiwan Strait 3 times. It's exactly the same, just one sentence. We try to preserve peace and prosperity, stability on the Taiwan Strait. It is not our Taiwan policy, it's policy toward Taiwan Strait. So we still respect one China policy. We don't express any officially our policy toward Taiwan as a political entity. We just think that the stability and peace in the Taiwan Strait is important because it's related to our trade, military stability, and so on. So our official position is just the same. But I think I know why Professor Jia asked that question, because our statement seems to be changing. For example, our president and foreign minister mentioned that we are opposed to any efforts to change the status quo based on coercion, which is the US rhetoric. So we are resembling or repeating to some part the US rhetoric. So we have to work on that. So what do we mean when we oppose to the change of status quo basic question. It could be North Korea or it could be other states, but basically we are affected by U.S.-China relations. So we are in the middle. We have a very difficult situation, which is related to Francesca's question about the concept of crisis, because we are so much vulnerable to U.S.-China. Any possible confrontation, just still incident can be interpreted as a crisis for South Koreans. So we just hope that, as you suggested, we can participate in multilateral setting where we can raise our voice about our concerns about U.S.-China relations.